On December 22nd, 2018, a band took the stage in front of 250 employees gathered for a company celebration. It was a calm night by the sea, with music echoing across the beach and people relaxing at their tables. Then, without any warning at all, the ocean surged upward behind the stage. The platform collapsed, the lights went out, and people ran as the waves swept into the crowd. This would only be a small part of what would become a deadly tsunami. This is the story of the Sunda Strait tsunami. Most tsunamis begin with an earthquake underwater. When the seafloor suddenly shifts, it pushes the water above it upward, and that movement travels outward as fast-moving waves. Out in the open ocean, these waves can pass unnoticed, but once they reach shallow coastal areas, they rise and become dangerous. Many of these events occur along the Ring of Fire, the large seismic zone surrounding the Pacific Ocean. This area is made up of multiple tectonic plate boundaries, which means the ground is constantly under pressure. Countries in East Asia and Southeast Asia, Japan, the Philippines, Indonesia, and others, experience frequent earthquakes because they sit right on these fault lines. With so much activity offshore, tsunamis are a known risk in the region. Because most tsunamis follow earthquakes, people often have a few minutes to react. A strong quake near the coast is usually the first warning sign, and many countries have sirens, sensors, and early warning systems designed to alert people to move away from the shoreline. But this system depends on one thing: the presence of an earthquake. When there is no earthquake, identifying a tsunami becomes much harder. Without shaking, many people don't realize anything is happening until the waves arrive. This exact scenario happened on December 22nd, 2018, in the Sunda Strait. Multiple coastal towns and resorts in Indonesia were struck by a tsunami with no warning. There was no major earthquake, no natural cue for people to recognize, and no reason for anyone to leave the beach. Indonesia sits on one of the most active volcanic and seismic belts on Earth. With more than 100 active volcanoes and thousands of earthquakes every year, the country has experienced some of the most powerful natural events in recorded history. Two of the largest eruptions ever documented here: Mount Tambora in 1815, which caused the global Year Without Summer, and Krakatau in 1883, an eruption so strong it was heard thousands of kilometers away and reshaped the entire Sunda Strait. Because of this constant activity, people across Indonesia grew up familiar with natural hazards. Small earthquakes happen so often that most residents barely react to them. Coastal towns practice evacuation drills, schools teach students what to do during a tremor, and families learn to tell the difference between a mild quake and one that requires immediate action. Tsunami sirens, text alerts, and offshore warnings are part of daily life in many regions. For most Indonesians, earthquakes and tsunamis of various sizes are not unusual. They're simply part of living along the Ring of Fire. But the one thing everyone relies on is warning signs: shaking ground, receding water, or an official alert. On the night of December 22nd, 2018, none of those familiar signals appeared. Krakatau sits on the Sunda Strait, the narrow stretch of water between Java and Sumatra. For most of its early history, it was a quiet cluster of islands, something sailors and fishing communities simply lived around. It had erupted before, but nothing about those early events suggested it would later produce one of the most significant eruptions ever recorded. Historical notes from Dutch and Javanese sources mention small steam eruptions in the 1600s and 1700s. These were minor and didn't attract much attention. The volcano, like others along the Sunda Arc, was formed by the slow movement of tectonic plates. Magma rose beneath the islands, sometimes producing small bursts of activity, then settling again. In 1883, that changed. Early in the year, people noticed small ash plumes rising from the island. Ships passing through the strait heard distant rumbling, but activity like this wasn't unusual for a volcanic region. Then, on August 26th, Krakatoa entered a sustained eruption. Ash climbed high into the air, and nearby islands were coated in a thin layer of fine material. On August 27th, the eruption reached its peak. 4 major explosions occurred, the last one strong enough to cause much of the island to collapse into the sea. This collapse triggered multiple tsunamis around the strait, with some waves reaching more than 30 meters along the coast of Java and Sumatra. Entire coastal settlements were swept away, and more than 36,000 people lost their lives. Ash from the eruption circled the globe and affected weather patterns and sunsets for months. What remained of Krakatoa was a flooded caldera. For decades, it looked like the volcano had been destroyed. But in 1927, a new island arose from the center of the caldera. It was named Anak Krakatau, child of Krakatoa. Over time, this young volcano grew steadily, erupting frequently and reshaping its own shoreline. But in December 2018, Anak Krakatau would show that the story wasn't over. A sudden eruption and flank collapse would set off a tsunami that changed the lives of thousands of people around the Sunda Strait. December 2018 was supposed to be a relaxing time for the coastal towns in the Pandeglang Regency of Banten province. It was just 3 days away from Christmas, and the beaches of Java were full of families, tourists, and workers who had taken time off to enjoy the holiday season. Places like Karita, Anyer, Tanjung Lesung, and Semur were crowded in the evenings. People sat in bars overlooking the water, listened to music drifting from the beachfront speakers, and watched the waves crash softly along the shore. To everyone there, it felt like a completely normal night. There was nothing unusual in the air, nothing that hinted at danger. It was just another peaceful evening. But while the beaches felt calm, Anak Krakatau, the island volcano in the middle of the Sunda Strait, had been slowly changing for months. Back in June of 2018, it began showing signs of small eruptions. Just minor blasts of volcanic rocks and steady plumes of smoke rising from the crater. Nothing major, nothing alarming. Locals were used to the volcano acting up from time to time. Even tourists sometimes took photos of the glowing crater at night. Most people never imagined these small eruptions were the first signs of a much bigger problem. In the months leading up to December, scientists monitoring the volcano noticed something strange. The volcano's thermal activity was climbing higher than normal, and the southwestern flank of Anak Krakatau had begun deforming at a faster rate. Something inside the volcano was shifting, but to the people living in the nearby coastal towns, none of this was visible. The skies were overcast almost every night. It was dark, and from 50 kilometers away, nobody could see what was happening on the island. At 8:46 p.m. Western Indonesia time, everything changed. In a single sudden movement, roughly half of the southwestern side of Anak Krakatau collapsed into the ocean. Scientists later estimated that about 150 to 180 million cubic meters of volcanic rock fell into the sea. To put that into perspective, that's enough material to bury an entire city block under a 100-meter tall pile of debris. When that much mass crashes into the ocean at once, the water has no choice but to move outward with explosive force. That movement became the tsunami. It only took about 20 to 30 minutes for the wave to reach Java's shores. Back on the beaches of Pandeglang Regency, people were still unaware that anything had happened. There was no earthquake to warn them. There were no sirens. There were no alerts on their phones. It was nighttime, so they couldn't see the shape of the wave approaching. People kept talking, drinking, laughing, and walking by the water completely unaware that a destructive wall of water was racing toward them. Just minutes before the tsunami had reached land, a few people noticed something strange. Some said they heard a loud rumbling sound, almost like distant thunder. Others described it as a crackling sound, like something heavy was breaking apart. But before anyone could investigate or react, the tsunami struck. Along many parts of the coastline, the wave was between 2 to 5 meters high. It wasn't the tallest tsunami Indonesia had ever seen, but it didn't need to be. What made it deadly was the lack of warning and the fact that it hit areas full of people who were sitting, walking, or relaxing right at sea level. The beaches of Karita, Tanjung Lesung, Samur, and Palembang were hit the hardest. People who had been sitting by the shoreline were suddenly overwhelmed by rushing water and pulled underwater before they even had time to stand up. Inside beachside resorts and restaurants, guests had seconds to react. The water burst into buildings, knocking out the power and plunging everything into total darkness. People tried to run upstairs or climb onto higher floors, but the wave came so quickly that many people didn't even know which direction to go. Survivors later said that during the chaos, they could see phone screens glowing underwater as people tried desperately to hold on to them. Others described hearing furniture, dishes, and parts of buildings crashing around them in the darkness as they searched for safety. One of the most tragic moments happened in Tanjung Lesung, where a popular Indonesian band called 17 was performing for a year-end corporate event hosted by PLN, the state-owned electricity company. The stage was set up near the beach. Around 250 employees and their families were gathered to enjoy the music. During the performance, a member of the audience was recording the band with their phone. The video captured what became the most well-known footage of the disaster. In the middle of the song, without warning, the tsunami hit the stage from behind. The structure collapsed instantly and the water rushed into the crowd. Many people at the event were swept away. Several members of 17 were killed, including guitarist Herman Sikumbang, bassist Muhammad Awal Purbani, Andy Windu Darmawan, the band's manager Oki Wijaya, and the band technician Ujang Nugraha. Also among the victims was actress Dylan Sahara, the wife of lead vocalist Rayfian Ifan Baharshia, who had accompanied him and the band. Ifan was the only member of the band who survived. The tragedy became one of the most heartbreaking stories from that night. The destruction along the coast was severe. Beachfront buildings were hit first. Lightweight structures such as open-air restaurants, small shops, bars, event tents, and many resort facilities were swept away almost instantly. Hotels and villas along the Karita beach and the Tanjung Lesung suffered major structural damage, especially on the ground floors facing the sea. Swimming pools filled with debris. Parking lots were flooded. Vehicles were pushed against walls or carried into nearby fields. Boats were found stranded on roads far from the water. Wooden houses near the shoreline were flattened, while even the sturdier concrete buildings showed signs of broken windows, torn doors, and damaged foundations. Streets were filled with mud, sand, and shattered wood. Electrical poles fell over, entire neighborhoods went dark, and communication lines were destroyed. Rescue teams struggled to reach some areas because the roads were covered in rubble. With power out across much of the region, nighttime search efforts were nearly impossible. People used flashlights, phone screens, and even the burning debris just to navigate through the darkness. Many survivors climbed onto the roofs of buildings or took shelter on higher ground until morning came. When daylight finally arrived, the true scale of the disaster became clear. Hundreds of people had been killed in the span of just minutes. Hundreds more were missing. Over 1,500 people were injured, and more than 22,000 people were displaced from their homes. Entire communities left in ruins, and many families were separated during the chaos. In the end, a total of 430 people lost their lives and many dozens more remain missing to this day. Authorities initially struggled to understand what had caused the tsunami. Earthquake sensors had recorded no activity. For several hours, there was confusion about whether the wave had been triggered by something else. But once researchers inspected Anak Krakatau, the answer became clear. A massive section of the volcano had collapsed into the ocean. Before the collapse, Anak Krakatau stood about 338 meters tall. Afterward, the volcano had reduced to just around 110 meters. The missing piece of volcano was now sitting underwater, its collapse the source of the deadly wave. There have been tsunamis far larger and deadlier than the one that hit the Sunda Strait. But what makes this disaster so terrifying is how it arrived. There was no warning, no earthquake, no signs that anything was wrong. People living in earthquake-prone areas know what to look for when a tsunami is coming, but this time, there was nothing. No one imagined that a volcano would suddenly collapse into the ocean and unleash a massive wave. Krakatoa has a long history of destruction, and in many ways, history repeated itself. Even in its smaller, weakened form, Anak Krakatau was still powerful enough to cause immense damage and take hundreds of lives. Today, the volcano looks completely different from what it once was. After the 2018 Sunda Strait tsunami, Anak Krakatau is even smaller, with most of its flank gone. But the truth is, no one really knows what this volcano is capable of in the future. It has erupted before, it collapsed before, and at any point, it could change again.